Bill, Daniel, and Chris stood their ground in the dimly lit warehouse, facing the group of men who had cornered them. The leader of the group stepped forward, his face twisted into a cruel smirk. "You really think you can stop us?" he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Before Bill could respond, Chris let out a fierce bark and lunged forward, his teeth bared. The men stumbled back, caught off guard by the dog's sudden aggression. Daniel took advantage of the distraction, grabbing a nearby metal pipe and swinging it at one of the men. The man fell to the ground with a cry of pain. "Run!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Bill's arm and pulling him toward the door. Chris stayed close, his movements quick and sure despite the chaos. They ran through the warehouse, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them. The men were relentless, but Bill, Daniel, and Chris were determined to escape. When they reached the exit, Bill turned to Daniel. "We need to split up," he said, his voice urgent. "They can't follow us both." Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "Meet me at the old ranger station," he said. "And be careful." Bill and Chris took off in one direction, while Daniel went the other. The men chasing them hesitated for a moment, then split up as well. Bill's heart pounded as he ran, Chris close at his side. The forest was dark and unfamiliar, but Bill trusted Chris to lead the way. Meanwhile, Marie ran through the night, clutching the folder of evidence tightly. Her heart raced as she thought about Bill, Daniel, and Chris, hoping they would be okay. She knew she had to get the evidence to the authorities, but the nearest town was miles away. She needed a plan. As she ran, a car's headlights appeared in the distance. Marie hesitated, then stepped into the road, waving her arms frantically. The car slowed, then stopped. The driver, an elderly man, rolled down his window. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Marie nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I need to get to the police," she said. "It's an emergency." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Get in," he said. "I'll take you." Marie climbed into the car, her heart still racing. She glanced back at the forest, hoping Bill and the others would be okay. She knew the evidence in her hands was the key to exposing the truth, and she couldn't let them down. Back in the forest, Bill and Chris ran until they reached a small stream. Bill stopped to catch his breath, his legs trembling with exhaustion. Chris laid down at his feet, his sides heaving. Bill knelt down and scratched behind the dog's ears, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You're a brave boy, Chris," he said softly. "We're going to get through this." But before they could rest for long, the sound of footsteps made them both freeze. Chris's ears perked up and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Bill stood, his heart pounding as he scanned the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Bill's heart sank as he recognized Tom. Tom looked different from the last time Bill had seen him. His face was pale, and his eyes were filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Bill," he said, his voice trembling, "I need your help." Bill's jaw tightened. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his voice cold. Tom flinched, but he didn't back down. "Because I know where they're keeping Daniel," he said. "And if we don't act fast, he's not going to make it." Bill hesitated, then nodded. "All right," he said. "But if this is a trap, you're on your own." Tom nodded, his expression grim. "Follow me." As Bill and Chris followed Tom deeper into the forest, Bill's mind raced. He didn't trust Tom, but he knew he couldn't leave Daniel to face whatever danger he was in alone. Chris stayed close, his eyes alert and his body tense. The night was far from over, and the fight for the truth was just beginning. Bill, Chris, and Tom moved silently through the forest, the moonlight casting long shadows on the ground. Tom led the way, his movements quick and deliberate, but Bill couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He didn't trust Tom, not after everything that had happened, but if Daniel was in danger, he had no choice but to follow. Chris stayed close to Bill, his ears perked and his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of danger. The dog's presence was a small comfort, but Bill knew they were walking into a trap. He just hoped they could get to Daniel in time. After what felt like an eternity, Tom stopped and pointed to a small clearing ahead. "They're keeping him in there," he said, his voice low. "But we need to be careful. They're expecting us." Bill frowned. "Why would they be expecting us?" Tom hesitated, then spoke. "Because they know you're coming," he said. "They've been watching you, Bill. They know everything." Bill's heart sank. If they were walking into a trap, they needed a plan. But before he could say anything, the sound of footsteps made them all freeze. Chris let out a low growl, his body tense. Bill turned to see a group of men emerging from the trees, their faces hidden in the shadows. "Looking for someone?" one of them asked, his voice cold and menacing. Bill stepped in front of Chris, his heart pounding. "Stay back," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. The man smirked. "You really think you can stop us?" Before Bill could respond, Chris lunged forward, his teeth bared. The men stumbled back, caught off guard by the dog's sudden aggression. Tom took advantage of the distraction, grabbing a rock and hurling it at one of the men. The man fell to the ground with a cry of pain. "Run!" Tom shouted, grabbing Bill's arm and pulling him toward the clearing. Bill hesitated, but Chris was already running ahead, his movements quick and sure. They followed the dog into the clearing, where they found Daniel tied to a tree, his face bruised and bloodied. Bill's heart ached at the sight, but there was no time to waste. "Daniel," Bill shouted, running to his friend's side. "Are you okay?" Daniel nodded weakly. "I've been better," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we need to get out of here. Now." Bill quickly untied Daniel, his hands trembling with urgency. Chris stood guard, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Tom stood nearby, his expression grim. "We need to move," he said. "They're coming." As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed through the clearing. Bill and Daniel stood back to back, ready to face whatever came next. Chris let out a fierce bark, his body tense and ready. Tom stood beside them, his eyes filled with determination. The men emerged from the trees, their faces twisted with anger. But before they could attack, the sound of sirens filled the air. The men hesitated, their eyes darting to the source of the noise. Bill's heart leaped as he realized what was happening. Marie had done it. She had gotten the evidence to the authorities. The men turned and ran, disappearing into the trees as the sirens grew louder. Bill let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, his legs trembling with relief. Daniel slumped against him, his strength finally giving out. "We need to get out of here," Bill said, his voice urgent. "Before they come back." Tom nodded, his expression grim. "Follow me," he said. "I know a way out." Bill and Daniel followed Tom, with Chris close behind. They moved quickly through the forest, the sound of sirens fading behind them. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, Bill turned to Tom, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped us." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I made a lot of mistakes," he said, "but I'm trying to make things right. For Chris, and for all of us." Bill placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, his expression softening. "You did good, Tom," he said. "Now let's get out of here." As they walked away from the forest, Bill couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The truth was finally out, and they had survived the fight. But he knew their journey was far from over. There were still questions that needed answers, and secrets that needed to be uncovered. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. Bill, Daniel, Chris, and Tom emerged from the forest, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the landscape. In the distance, they could see the flashing lights of police cars and hear the faint sound of voices. Marie had kept her promise. She had gotten the evidence to the authorities. As they approached the edge of the forest, a group of police officers spotted them and quickly moved in their direction. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "Are you Bill?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Bill nodded, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Yes," he said. "We have evidence. We need to talk to someone in charge." The officer nodded and gestured for them to follow. "Come with me," he said. "We'll take you to the station." Bill, Daniel, and Tom followed the officer, with Chris trotting loyally beside them. Marie was already at the police station, her face pale but determined. When she saw them, she rushed over, her eyes filled with relief. "You're okay," she said, her voice trembling. "I was so worried." Bill gave her a small smile. "We made it," he said. "Thanks to you." Marie nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I just did what I had to do," she said. "But it's not over yet. They're still out there." Bill's expression hardened. "We'll make sure they pay for what they've done," he said. "But first, we need to tell the police everything." The group was led into a small room at the police station, where they were asked to recount their story. Bill and Daniel took turns explaining everything: the threats, the conspiracy, and the danger they had faced. Marie provided the folder of evidence, which contained names, dates, and detailed accounts of the crimes that had been committed. As the hours passed, more officers came and went, their expressions growing increasingly serious. It was clear that the evidence they had provided was significant, and the authorities were taking it very seriously. Finally, the lead investigator, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, turned to Bill. "We'll need you to stay here for a while," she said. "There's a lot to go through, and we may need your help to piece everything together." Bill nodded, his exhaustion evident. "We'll do whatever we can," he said. "But we need to make sure Chris is taken care of." The investigator smiled for the first time. "Don't worry," she said. "We'll make sure your dog is safe. He's a hero, after all." Chris wagged his tail at the mention of his name, his eyes bright despite the long night. Bill knelt down and scratched behind the dog's ears, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You did good, boy," he said softly. "You saved us all." As the day wore on, the group began to feel the weight of everything they had been through. Tom sat quietly in the corner, his face filled with regret. Marie stayed close to Bill and Daniel, her presence a small comfort in the chaos. And Chris, ever loyal, stayed by Bill's side, his presence a reminder of the bond they shared. But even as they began to feel safe, Bill knew their journey was far from over. The truth had been exposed, but the fight was not yet won. There were still questions that needed answers, and secrets that needed to be uncovered. And Bill was determined to see it through, no matter what it took.